Okay, well, this is the update for week 6 of the my time in school, summer semester 2024. It's crazy that we're almost halfway through this semester already. It's pretty amazing. So this week was a little bit lighter, thankfully, because I had a couple of big projects to do last week that some of the classes had. So it was nice to have a little bit slower week this week. The Chinese class was a little slower. The Christianity class was not slower. It was just cranking right along, which was fine. It was good. And then the intro to religion class actually was decent. It was a decent one as well. So um, the let's start with the Chinese class. I literally just finished on my homework for the week for that class, so it's kind of fresh on my mind to think about. The so this week we talked about the Han Dynasty, which last week was the Qin Dynasty. You remember they had the Hundred Flowers period, where they had all the different warlord factions basically that had broken out, and so the Qin Dynasty ended up taking all of them over. Using a philosophy called legalism in Chinese. If you want to look it up, that's a term to look up. It's kind of like a philosophy similar to communism, basically, as far as like how you arrange your government and put things in place. Everybody's efforts are for the benefit of the government, those kinds of things. It's So he uses that to do it. The problem is legalism does not work well in peaceful times. So after the Qin Dynasty takes everything over, the people get a little sick of living under legalism, and so there's a revolt that happens. Things go south. A couple of the dynasties, which ones were at? I think I've got my notes over here. Let's see. There was two dynasties that were some of the last ones to be taken. I'm still trying to get all the Chinese names down. The Yan and Chu dynasties. They were the two of the last ones for the Qin dynasty to take over, and then they were the first to revolt and rebel. They kind of remembered, hey, you remember when we were all a bunch of independent warlords? Life was better at that time, so let's go back to that. So they revolted against the Qin dynasty and fought back. Things kind of fall apart, warlords come back around, and eventually things get wrapped back together under the Han Dynasty. This is not the dynasty named after Han Solo. This is the dynasty from 207 BC to 220 AD. So if you think in terms of Christianity, this would be from around the Maccabean revolt time frames during the intermediary period between Old Testament and New Testament, well past the time of Christ and his apostles into the first century AD. That's the Han Dynasty during that time period, basically. So to just give you a bit of a frame of reference for that. This dynasty was huge and rivaled in comparison with the Roman dynasty. If you think about it, for the whole dynasty of Rome, basically, they covered some big areas. They never really met because Central Asia was right between them. So Middle East, Central Asia area, but they knew of each other. There was some, people would sometimes do some traveling and come across people from each other's kingdoms. So that's what happened there. Now the Han Dynasty was the king, the emperor, I should say, lowered the taxes on people, made it easier, to live and do things. Changed some of the rules around, got rid of the old aristocracy, created a new one, basically created more of a meritocracy in China. And what that means is instead of certain families ruling everything in China underneath the emperor, basically, he created a system where you learn as you learn and get educated and have your skills and you grow in your performance. So there's like tests you can take to gain proficiencies in the laws and philosophy of the land, which was Confucianism, which is interesting because Confucianism was banned and destroyed in previous dynasty, the Qin dynasty, but in the Han dynasty, they went, no, we want to get rid of legalism for the most part. We kept a little bit of it, put a little bit of Taoism in there, and mingled that with Confucianism, and that became the main philosophy of the kingdom. Not quite a religion of the kingdom, but a similar concept. Um, and so when they pull all this together, you gain this opportunity where you can actually raise your level, you can increase your status in society by passing these tests, basically by knowing Confucianism, by knowing the rules and laws and following them. So you could pass these tests and gain more status in society, basically. So that's meritocracy. It was pretty interesting. I mean, it's different, very different way of doing it. People liked it for a while. Then they kind of got the ruling class kind of got lazy down the road, and then it all fell apart again. This happens so much. It's fascinating. The thing that's been fascinating about learning Chinese history is seeing the exact same trends that we see in Middle East and European history there as well. You know, we think of even how some of these ancient dynasties would happen. You know, people would revolt and they would get against their leaders. There was changes in how Rome did things. Rome went through two civil wars during their time frames. Before Christ's time, they had two civil wars basically before they settled on the idea of Caesar, the one emperor to rule everything. But even then, Rome got lazy, and when the Mongols came in and fought them, the Mongols realized, man, we got to wipe these guys out. They're nothing. In fact, even Rome tried to go up and take out the barbarians, or the people from Scandinavia and Germany that were looking for better land, and they just wanted to be left alone. They're like, look, just give us our land, leave us alone. We don't care what you guys do down in your kingdom. But Rome's like, no, we care what you guys do. We want to take you over and dominate you. So they sent an entire garrison up to fight the barbarians, and the barbarians just wiped them out. And so Rome went, okay, we're going to hide that part of history and ignore it and leave you guys alone. But it's the same problems. Rome went through the same problems. Even Eastern Orthodox, Byzantine, all these different groups go through similar problems. It's fun to see this pattern repeat. Even in China, they faced the same problems. Even that same idea of hard times make hard men make good times make soft men make hard times. That same pattern still happens in China. It was really interesting. So some fun things that we got to learn this week. In fact, kind of an update on the first emperor of China, his mausoleum that he had built himself with the terracotta army and things. Apparently, they had put a wooden structure in place to hold the ground up above it, because remember they kind of hid it by putting a garden over the top. They had a wooden structure that would support the land that was up there, but there were for some reason, we weren't told what in the class. I don't know if the people know what happened, but at some point that mausoleum caught fire. There was a fire inside, and it burned all the wood timber down, and the ground above collapsed down, which is why the terracotta army was buried. They had to excavate it out, basically. So that was kind of an interesting update there. So the Han Dynasty is one of the more well-known ones. You hear about them quite a bit. It unified China once again, but man, was there a lot of fighting to get to that point. It was a pretty crazy time. So in fact, we found out there's actually a video game you can get on Steam that's all about the Three Kingdoms. If you look up Three Kingdoms, it talks about how they all eventually after they split into warlords, they eventually consolidated the Three Kingdoms, and then they eventually came together into one large kingdom again, basically. Crazy times, some crazy times. We did learn a little bit more about women's roles in China as well, and that was interesting to look at. That basically a woman's role, they were seen somewhat like property, like in ancient Middle East and ancient Europe, still as well. Similar ideas. Women their job was to honor their father and to obey their father in everything. So the father kind of had control over their life. Respect their father, filial piety for their father. It's a Confucius idea. As they did that, though, then they get married, so they respect their husband, please their husband, take care of their husband, do all the domestic work and everything else. And then if their husband died, then their oldest son would be the man that they would have to work with and do things with, basically. So it's surprisingly not that different than what we saw in, like I says, in more the ancient world through the Middle East and Europe. So it's just interesting how these concepts, kind of stayed similar. It's fascinating. There's a story in, I don't know if it's like philosophy, I guess, called the 100th Monkey. And this comes to mind as I'm thinking about these ideas, how even though these are completely separate nations, Europe, Rome, all that area is completely separate from China, but yet there's a lot of common philosophies and ideas that seem to resonate. The story of the 100th Monkey is a story of scientists that were studying the behavior of monkeys on two islands. These islands were more than a mile apart, so far enough apart that the monkeys aren't swimming back and forth and communicating with each other. But it's a similar species of monkeys on two different islands, and they're trying to understand these monkeys and behaviors. Well, on one island, these monkeys start to learn how to break open the coconuts in a new way. They use a rock to hit it. Before, they just had to they just got a coconut and smashed it and then opened it up, basically. Whereas the other ones found a rock. If you hit it on a sharp point, you can crack them and then preserve it better. It's just a more efficient way. So as that knowledge spread on one island among all those monkeys, they noticed that once this entire island learned about it and they adopted that idea, suddenly the monkeys on this island over here started to do the same thing, basically. So the knowledge transferred itself to them without a direct communication link between them. So maybe that's where some of this quantum tunneling concept comes from. I don't know. I'm not sure. The jury is definitely still out on that. But it's interesting that some ideas stick in society and then tend to emanate out, and other people near them adopt the same ideas without even realizing it. So there's definitely something else going on, some kind of a connection or transfer of wisdom and information that happens that we're not quite fully aware of. But it's just interesting how same challenges, same problems, even some philosophies were similar at similar time frames as other nations. One thing that's interesting too about the Han Dynasty is they invented paper. So the Han Dynasty invented paper. Basically, they were the first to do it. They got bamboo shoots. They would boil them, pull all the fibers out, basically into like a soup, strain all the water out so they get the fibers. They'd arrange them, get them all laid out, and to stamp them out into these big sheets, and then they would dry them, and that was paper. They made paper from bamboo pulp, basically. They invented it, and then they later came in contact with other people who learned it as well, adopted it, and then it transferred eventually into Europe. And Europe started to use paper later on, as like hundreds of years later. Europe went, oh, this is cool, this idea. Where'd you get it from? Well, the Chinese have had it for hundreds of years. Oh, that's so cool. So Chinese is where paper originated, this idea, basically, which was cool. I didn't realize that. That was kind of fun. So that's kind of the main thing that we talked about in the Chinese history class, is the Han Dynasty, some of the interesting things that came out of that dynasty. Again, lots of similarities to how empires rose and fell, even in the ancient Middle East and ancient Europe. Also, really interesting how there's patterns that are still there, even though they're nations that at the time weren't in communication with each other that much, but they have a lot of similarities. History repeats itself. There's patterns. So let's jump to the Christianity class. Let's talk about that. So that shifts us over into Europe and even into North America. In that class, we are talking about the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, and starting to get into the 1900s a little more. So this is the time of Reformation. So we've all heard the Great Reformation ideas, Martin Luther, Zwingli, John Calvin, the great reformers, how they broke off to create what we call Protestantism. So there's Catholicism, okay, which is your Western Christianity. Eastern Christianity is the Byzantium, your Eastern Orthodox, a little bit different version of Christianity over there, more ritual based. Catholicism comes out and says, okay, this is what we're going to do. And Catholicism has a huge, like centuries long war with the state. So this idea of should the state supersede the religion, or should religion supersede the state? Some areas the state and religion was the exact same thing. They all merged together basically. So in a way, the Pope had almost equal authority to the king. But sometimes the king wanted more authority. Sometimes the Pope would want more authority. That went back and forth for a long, long time. And then the Protestants come in and say, we think that's a bunch of load of baloney, and we think the church has gone corrupt and has gone bad, and has manipulated the scriptures to do what they want, and we think it's terrible, so we're going to go off and teach in a different direction. And that's the Protestant group. And so those Protestants eventually, as they grow and expand and do more, they eventually make it to America, and then America ends up in America is interesting actually. What people we think of, like the Puritans are the first group of people to America. They came over seeking religious freedom, and ironically would not let anybody else have religious freedom after they established themselves here. If you didn't believe in Puritanism, we didn't like you. You were just kicked out of the society. It's so ironic how that worked out. That's usually what we think about. What we don't realize is the Spanish, okay, because the Spanish were the ones that backed Christopher Columbus. They had Spanish Catholicism in America before the Puritans. So Catholicism started to spread and grow and do more. Then the Puritans come in with their philosophies and ideas, and then eventually we get more of Protestantism moving this way, because there's so much opportunity in America. So Protestantism then comes in. Then there's clashes between Catholicism and Protestantism and things that happen back in the 1700s and things. And this is a time when, while this all is happening, Catholicism goes through its own Reformation. So this is really, I never heard this before. I never thought about this. I always think the Great Reformation is the split between Catholicism and Protestantism. But as this split happens, the Catholic Church re-examines themselves in the same time frame to say, hey, people are leaving. We need to revamp what we're doing. They did a Reformation internally. The Catholicism did this Reformation. And that's where there's a big push for missionary efforts to branch out, to go to America, to convert people there, to go to China, in fact. Matteo Ricci was a Jesuit priest who did the missionary efforts in China. So that's kind of fun to see these two classes kind of cross over, basically, as well. I'm learning about Chinese history, but then I'm learning about Christianity, and now they blend with Matteo Ricci. So a little bit on Matteo Ricci. He's a Jesuit priest. He goes over there, and the predominant philosophy of the time comes from your Franciscan and Dominican monks. So those are two different versions of monks, Franciscan monks and Dominican monks. You've probably maybe heard those names in the past. They had this tendency when they did mission work to basically move into an area and impose Christianity on the people. So probably the most popular ones we can think of is Central and South America. When the conquistadors come down, it's Dominican and Franciscan monks that come in to do Christianity, and they basically impose, they basically claim that the people are living a pagan religion, and they need to have it just, that religion needs to go away, and they need to adopt Christianity because Christianity is the only way. And so they impose Christianity on the people. They force them into it, basically. Whereas Matteo Ricci, as a Jesuit priest, he decided to go a different route. It was a little softer. So when he went to China, he went in and he started to wear Chinese clothes. He ate the Chinese food, and everybody in his missionary entourage, he said, you're going to do the same thing. We're going to acclimate into their society. So they acclimated into their society. He learned Confucianism. He understood where they came from. And then he taught the higher class, because if the higher class adopted Christianity, the lower class would automatically accept it. So he found a way to get into the society, and then looked for ways that Confucius ideas and Christianity connected, and would meet them there. This was a similar idea. I had to do a report for my Christianity class last week on this same similar type of concept of these Jesuit priests going into India, and they did the same thing. This is where the veneration of the Mother Mary made a big difference. So in Catholicism, they believe in the concept of saints. So there's God and Christ, but then there's this layer of saints in between us and God and Christ. So we can't necessarily talk to God and Christ as much, but what we can do is relay messages to the saints. These are holy people who've had miracles performed and verified and things. They go through the sainthood process. They're considered saints. We can pray to them. They can then supplicate that message up to Christ and God, basically. And so it's kind of this hierarchy of getting your message to who it needs to get to. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, was seen as not necessarily the first saint, but kind of a main saint that you could pray to. Hence why we see the Mother Mary so much in Central America with Our Lady Guadalupe that was there, as well as all through Europe. We see churches, cathedrals to Mary, and a lot of devout people in honor of her. So when they went into India, the idea was India had this idea, the concept of goddess worship. There were goddesses in India, so there's gods and goddesses, and the goddesses could do things on their own, but then they would also get their husbands, the gods, to do things too. So you could pray to a goddess and get them to work with the gods to get what you needed. So this was a common theme, and so they would use that to integrate Christian ideas with the native ideas of Hinduism. Now, this same idea is kind of what Matteo Ricci tried to do in China, looking for ways that Confucianism and Christianity can come together, and then use that to help people go, look, we're not that far different from you. Let's talk. We're not completely foreign. We're similar. Let's talk. And they would integrate in. The problem that happened with this, though, is you had people who are, so in China, veneration of your ancestors is super, super important. There's a common belief in China that when your ancestors die, they kind of form a layer similar to the saints in Catholicism, in Christianity, basically. So you can pray to your ancestors, and as they deliver messages and do things, they get to move up in the ranks in heaven, basically, to be more venerated. And so immediate ancestors, and then distant ancestors, and then the gods kind of idea. And so you could it's important that you honor and respect your ancestors. So there's big funeral processions. There's sometimes annual rites where you go back and you honor sacrifices and things to your ancestors. In fact, on some of those sacrifices, they created paper versions of real things, like paper iPads, paper clothes, paper cars. And you could go to your ancestor's grave and to give up these items. So you're not literally like giving up an iPad, you're giving up the image of an iPad to them, and you'd burn it on have candles there, and you'd burn it as your sacrifice to your ancestors. Matteo Ricci, when he was in Christianity, or in China, preaching Christianity, he saw this as a cultural thing, not so much a religious thing. Unfortunately, though, he saw Confucianism as religion, so it kind of got muddied. China didn't necessarily have a religion per se like Christianity, but Confucianism was the philosophy of the day. So in a way, you could see it as a religion, but it kind of wasn't technically. But this is where the problem came in, is they had a lot of cultural traditions that Christianity was looking at going, yeah, from our perspective, that's kind of dumb to do. You don't need to do that. We don't believe in that in Christianity. So this begged the question, can you be a good Chinese person culturally and Christian at the same time? Or are those in conflict with each other? And so to deal with this, Matteo Ricci was like, well, some of these things are cultural, not religious. So yeah, you're fine. Don't worry about it. But there was a debate about this. And so they ended up writing a letter back to these missionaries, wrote a letter back to the Pope to say, hey, we need some ecumenical counsel on this. What do you think we should do? Well, the Pope came back and said, that's all paganism. They need to get rid of it. If they want to be Christian, they need to get rid of it. And I think this is a good thing for us to think about, okay? And this is the reason I'm telling you this story and going into this detail is I think this is something that's important for us to consider, okay? We still have this same conundrum today. Whether you're LDS, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, it doesn't matter. This is still a problem and a challenge we have today. What this comes down to is sometimes there becomes a conflict of interests between the higher ups in the religion and the people on the front lines doing the missionary work that are helping people go from from being outside that religion to being inside that religion. You'll run into cultures and traditions and things that are very different, and you have to help the new converts decide, what do I keep? What am I allowed to bring from my past into this new religion? So anybody who's ever gone through a conversion process has experienced this. You had a life, you did things one way, you had a culture, you had beliefs and ideas. Now you're adjusting to a new life. Some religions are very rigid to get into, and you have to make a lot of changes. Okay, in LDS culture, the biggest change, other than like what you do on Sundays, keeping Sabbath day holy, is word of wisdom. So Mormons, LDS people do not smoke, they do not drink, and are very, very strict on tea as well. So, and no coffee. So, but everybody else in the world, that's totally fine, acceptable. So when you join the LDS church, you have to make some dietary changes to be accepted. Basically, you have to be willing to make those changes. So that's a big cultural change that can happen sometimes, or every time it happens. So here's the thing, though. When somebody brings their culture over to the new religion, it sometimes starts to skew the perspective of the religion. And this is a challenge for the higher ups, because the higher ups are part of their job, their charge in the religion is to protect the sanctity, protect the religion from getting what we call, in the tech world, we call it scope creep. This is where you set out a series of, like, you have a goal of something you want to build software for, but then as you build the software, it starts to get bigger. Like, oh, now we need to add this feature in. Now we need to add this feature in. And you just get so many features in, your software kind of becomes bland and it doesn't stay focused on what it needs to do. So the higher ups in a religion have to maintain integrity of the boundaries of that religion. And the problem is when you're at this missionary level, you're at the ground level trying to help people join, is sometimes you have to look at these cultures and go, maybe that can translate over and maybe that can't. And this is a hard thing to debate. In fact, in the New Testament, we see this. When you look at the ideas of Jewish Christians versus Gentile Christians, okay? When Christ taught the gospel in the New Testament, he taught the Jews. He taught Jewish people his gospel, he took the law of Moses and elevated it. Said, here's what Moses said, but here's what I'm going to add to it. So this is letter of the law. Here's the spirit of the law. I'm not destroying the law of Moses necessarily, but I'm expanding it, adding to it basically to make it better. That's that idea of continuous revelation. But here's the thing, okay? The Jews took their Jewish culture and added Christian ideas to it, okay? So their Jewish culture was they had certain dietary restrictions. To join, you had to be circumcised for men. You had to observe the feasts, the holidays, the ceremonies of the Jewish tradition. So when the church started in the New Testament times, it had a very Jewish culture in Christianity. But as Gentiles joined the church, now we have this huge debate, and we see this play out in Paul's writings there was an ecumenical council in Jerusalem where all the apostles had to come back and they had to get together and decide, what are we going to do about this? Because the Gentiles said, Jesus never taught circumcision. That's a Jewish cultural thing. We're Gentile. We don't believe in that. And there's nowhere in the known understanding of Christ's writings that say that we are required to undergo circumcision. And we don't need to follow the dietary laws of Judaism. And this was a clash. This was a problem because all the Jews said, if a Gentile is going to join Christianity, they have to be circumcised. And the Gentiles said, no, we don't. That's a Jewish tradition, not a Christian tradition. And so as these two cultures blended into the idea of Christianity, there was a big problem, a dilemma that the early apostles had to deal with. And again, we see this play out through the letters of Paul in his writings. In fact, this is the big debate between Paul and Peter. Paul shows up at a house one day where a bunch of the saints were gathered together, and he sees Peter in a room with Gentiles, and he's eating food that would be against the law in Jewish culture, but it's totally okay in Gentile culture. And he's enjoying and having a good time with these people. But as these Jews walk by and see Paul, knowing they know Paul is actually a Jew by family, basically, Paul pulls back from the table and kind of leaves and doesn't deal with the people anymore and stops eating the food because he's embarrassed to be seen in this trap culturally. The Jews are like, oh, we don't want to, the prophets following the Gentiles. Oh my gosh, and so Paul's in this conundrum or Peter's in this conundrum. So Paul calls him out for it, basically in one of his letters I think it's in the book of Acts that story plays out. I can't remember off the top of my head, but anyways, so this idea of culture and doctrine is a big problem. And we see it still in churches today. So this is a thing we have to think about, okay? So we have to always realize the people at the higher up levels of the church leaders, they have a responsibility of defining the boundaries of what is part of the religion and what is not. And sometimes they do get this wrong. Sometimes they get strict. They usually err on the side of tradition. They usually err on the side of we're staying the way we always have been because that's established. Whereas down at the missionary efforts, you're getting missionaries going out there doing their work. They want to baptize people and bring people in. But when these cultural clashes hit, sometimes that causes issues with the missionary efforts. So that's where sometimes you get some conflict between the higher ups and the lower end of a religion, basically. So this is not a new idea. This is not a new concept. We see this in today's world in a lot of churches in America dealing with what do we do about LGBTQ people? Do we accept them, as some religions at the high levels have said, you know what? We're expanding our horizon and we're going to accept them in. Other religions are going, nope, we've never accepted them and we're not going to accept them. We're staying traditional. Who's right or wrong? That's up to the debate. That's where you have to focus on the Spirit and guidance by God himself to understand those things. But just realize this is not a new thing. This has happened many times before. This is just how that dynamic plays out. So when we understand these connections and the pattern of these problems, now we can start to think about how do we find a solution to this. So that's why I bring it up, just to make that point. It's an important one for us to think about. So in Christianity during the 1700s, and I hadn't thought about this either before, I'd heard the idea of like rationalism coming into Christianity. So around the 1600s, late 1600s into the 1700s, the philosophy of Christianity makes a big shift. Part of this could be because of the reformers peeling off and creating this other culture, Christian culture, and then they have to work out these differences. So before this time, Christianity was really centered on some major philosophies up through Catholicism that were very hard set. And then they decided, as they looked at this from a rational standpoint, as science starts to take off, technology starts to move, we start getting new developments in understandings of things, they start looking back at these old ideas of Christianity and going, I don't know if that's right anymore. So like the idea of predestination was something that sometimes comes up. In the old Christian philosophy, it became very common to realize that some people were guaranteed to be saved and some weren't. If you weren't in that class of people that had salvation given to them, you're just screwed. There's nothing for you, basically. So only some were saved and some were not. Later on, they went, I don't know about that. We need to rethink that. And that kind of went away, and Protestantism really ran with the idea of we disagree. Protestantism came from a very different standpoint of, instead of doing the ordinances right to focusing more on having a spiritual experience with the Holy Spirit, basically. So that's more of your evangelicalism and things that came out of that. So it's fascinating, this split. Rationalism, science, and religion start to clash as well as work with each other. Some people believe that if it's not empirical, if I can't prove it with data, it's not true. So they start looking at the Bible from the standpoint of what can I prove? I will agree with the Bible in those parts, and if I can't prove it, I will throw it out. Whereas the religionists would say, I'm gonna use the Bible as my proof, my standard, and if science doesn't match with what the Bible says, I throw the science out. So there's these two competing ideas of more of a rational intellectualism versus religious philosophy. Which perspective do you come from? That starts around the 1700s time frame, and then grows and influences Protestantism. What is true, what is not? What can we prove, what can't we? And really changes the perspective of religious experience, which is where the Great Awakenings come from. That concept, those ideas emerged and helped with the Great Awakenings. And then, of course, America passes laws that say you're free to worship how you want. The government won't regulate it. We're going to give you, all religions, an equal opportunity to thrive. We're not going to impose limits on certain religions and other things. And so America has this great religious experiment that just allows religion to flourish and take off. So all kinds of variations and ideas and things start to happen all over the place. That's your Great Awakenings, first and second Great Awakenings period that gets you into the 1800s. And then we have just there's a consolidation that happens, but a flourishing of Protestantism, and even Catholicism still is mixed in there as well. And of course, the LDS Church comes from the early 1830s with Joseph Smith and branches off and continues on from there as well. So that's my Christian class. That was a really fun week for learning in my Christianity class, an area that I think I want to dive deeper into and understand the Great Awakenings and this rationalization period and how Christian thought changed during that time. I'll probably spend some more time reading that on my own. But it was good. In and last but not least, my class on Intro to Religious Studies, we were in these last week and this week, basically, we spent more time thinking more about ritual. How does ritual play into religion, and is it important? So we examined rituals from a lot of different religions, from Hinduism, from Islam, from Christianity, from prehistorical religious philosophies, Judaism, lots of different groups, and looked at how does ritual make a difference. The conclusion in looking at that is ritual makes a huge difference. So when you think of religion, you think of there's beliefs, there's doctrines, there's the teachings of the religion. But if all you have are teachings, the religion won't go very far. It really will stagnate and have problems. And so when you put ritual in there, ritual with beliefs, when you combine them, there's two things that happen. One is the ritual becomes somewhat symbolic and metaphoric to help you in understanding the beliefs. So rituals reinforce the truth of the beliefs, and the beliefs reinforce why we do the ritual. So they complement each other. They're two sides of the same coin, basically. So rituals make it easier for people to adopt the religion. So let me give an example of this. And I argued this in one of the papers that I had to do for this week in this class, is this idea. If you look at some religions are very high in rituals, okay? LDS Church, Catholic Church, your Eastern Orthodox churches, they're very high in rituals, okay? There's a very clear ritual to join the church. Baptism. So like in some of the Protestant churches, like Baptist Church and those, you have to be baptized. And so there's a clear ritual that says you've gone from being outside the church to being inside the church. And it makes that big distinction. That is very important for people joining the church. When they do that, it helps them see themselves as moving from out of the world into this new culture. So it helps them to put themselves in a frame of mind of, I'm now one of them because I've been baptized. I went through this ritual. There's something that delineates the change in my life. These kinds of religions that have a more clear distinction when you join also have a tendency they are harder to walk away from. Because you've made that clear distinction, you have to really, like, people will spend years racking their brains being in the religion but not really believing in it because they don't feel like they want to leave. They don't want to leave the culture of the religion that they don't want to see themselves as not one of them anymore, if that makes sense. Whereas if you look at religions, like sometimes you get in more of your evangelical religions where all you have to do is just proclaim Christ and believe. There isn't a delineated ritual that you have to go through to join the church. So in those religions, like, people will come and go. They'll move from religion to religion quite often because there's nothing holding them there. So rituals make a big difference in establishing people in a religion and helping them see themselves as a part of it. So you can't, but on the flip side, you can't have rituals without the beliefs that back up why do we do these rituals. So having both makes a big difference. Makes a big difference. Rituals help build culture. Rituals influence culture. Rituals will help you establish those beliefs. So you can study the beliefs through understanding the rituals, and you can understand rituals through studying beliefs. They go hand in hand with each other. And that's an important part of your ideas. Buddhism, there really isn't much of a ritual to join Buddhism. You just join and just do it so people can come and go from it. So it hasn't necessarily Buddhism isn't so much a true religion, but it kind of is. It's like Confucianism. It kind of is, but you could classify it as a religion. You could classify it not as a religion. We talked about that around week 1 and 2 in this class of how do you define what is a religion, what isn't. But because there isn't that clear delineated ritual to join, you have people come and go easily from it. The Masons would be kind of a non-religious idea of there's clear ritual in there, and so people tend to join and they're serious about joining. It's not a casual thing you join, but then they stay. They don't necessarily leave it all the time because the rituals help. So rituals in religion make a big difference. Not to mention they help us with habits. The ritual of going to church on Sunday, taking the sacrament, of doing things with your congregation, of meeting with people, the more we can build rituals to create positive atmosphere and beliefs are going to help out. So I think a great thing to think about from a leader's standpoint in a religion is, what are the beliefs we want to espouse? What are the concepts we want to encourage our followers to adopt and believe in? And what are some rituals we can put in place to help accomplish that, to help them see those as valid? If you can match that together and think through that, you can build a culture around your congregation that'll keep people there and doing more with you. So rituals make a big difference. So that was this week. There was a lot to cover, a lot to discuss. Last week I had a couple of big projects I had to do that I think I mentioned in last week's video about those. They were some big stuff, but it was fun. So I'm looking forward to learning more. If you have questions about anything, feel free to put it in the comments. Hopefully you're learning from these. What are some things that you have learned through these videos that have helped you in your life of understanding history and religion? I'd love to get your feedback. Do you find these videos valuable for me to do these weekly updates on what I'm learning in my classes? I want to help you come along with me to learn. I know it's costing me, like, man, what was this? I took 3 classes and it was like $3,700 to take these 3 classes at college. It's really expensive. But here's the beauty is you get to learn a lot of the same things I'm learning for free because of these videos. And I want people to come along and join this. So I hope you're enjoying these videos. if you're not, let me know. It's okay. I'm open to feedback. If you like them, if you don't like them, if there's certain things you want me to cover, certain questions you have, let me know. Be more than happy to work with you and make these more interactive. And hopefully you like them, like the videos, subscribe, share them, share the links out with other people that you think would be like to enjoy these subjects that I'm learning, and come along would be great. So I look forward to interacting with you more in the comment section. And we'll talk to you next week as well for our next update.